Chapter 241 Master Scouting. Master Scouting, FFF, Skill, Requirement, 100 Mental, 100 will use this skill to reveal master information on living and non-living targets. Scales with mental and will, basic information, species, grade, level, stats, abilities, advanced information, stat breakdown. Master information, skill information, comprehension information. Silas was pleasantly surprised to see this. Although he would only be able to see this information after a skill or comprehension was used, this was still far greater than anything he had faced before. In the past, he could only sense that a skill was being used and wait for the result. But with less than master scouting greater than, he could get a breakdown of the skill. But what was interesting was that advanced information, which should refer to less than advanced scouting greater than, included a stat breakdown. But Silas was already able to see this by using madness and less than basic scouting at the same time. In that case, if he used less than master scouting with madness, would he be able to see less than grandmaster scouting and formation? Or at least something close to it. At least for now, Silas didn't see a difference. But this would be very helpful in the future. Not only would it help him protect himself in battle, he would also be able to build an understanding of the most common skills as well. It would make him sharper in battle and make him capable of taking the initiative instead of always having to wait for others to act first. Basic of beast holding, F, treasure, small space capable of holding one mount up to level 10. It seemed that a mount was a very specific kind of beast, and their abilities were quite unique at that. This was something Silas had learned after he took a look at the beast out. Dire Wolf, F, mount, level 10. Attribute, empty, plus 40% speed and dexterity, limit, 200 speed and dexterity. It seemed that the stats of the mount were entirely dependent on the one riding them. But in exchange for this, they were highly limited. Normal mounts couldn't be used in combat. If Silas tried to enter a combat state while riding one, the subtle connection between the two would be broken and the mount would begin to rely on its own stats which were far weaker. This was true of all mounts regardless of grade. If you wanted a mount that could break these rules, you would need a combat mount. But by grade, a combat mount was easily tens to hundreds of times more expensive than a normal mount. Of course, Silas wasn't interested in such things because while others would have to rely on dens or the Nexus to trade for such things, his profession would allow him to create his own combat mount. The trouble, of course, was that he couldn't seem to form this subtle connection that allowed him to use the beast more like a treasure than a living being. For example, he couldn't ride the Basilisk King and use it as a conduit to increase his speed. But then again, he had never tried to do so either. Maybe there were hidden abilities to his profession that he wasn't aware of. Or maybe, there were certain skills that he could learn externally to supplement it. After all, he had seen an entire shop of items that could only be bought by certain professions, and many of them had been supplemental materials that taught one how to be more efficient and skillful in taking advantage of their profession. His profession had granted him the legendary tamer title, and it alone was the first legendary item he had seen. Until now, he had never even seen a silver item, so its specialness couldn't be underestimated. There was probably more potential within it that he had yet to realize. Silas hopped onto the back of the black-furred dire wolf. It was quite a valiant creature, with fur so thick it almost seemed to have a mane, and tall enough to stand almost 3 meters tall. Silas could even cross his legs on its back if he really wanted to, but he had to be sharp and always ready for battle. Even if he had a mount, he wouldn't allow himself to lower his guard. Or else, if he accidentally entered a battle state, he would die before he realized what happened. 196 speed and dexterity felt great. Even the dire wolf seemed like it was enjoying itself a great deal. Despite the density of trees, it weaved in and out of the region with great ease, and Silas himself felt that these sorts of stats were already approaching a level that only something with an engine could match. But unlike a car or something of the sort, the wolf was several times more agile. Even if he had a car available to him in this place, Silas would choose the wolf 10 out of 10 times. He had only casually asked for a mount, not even realizing that there was a special category of beast for this specific matter. But in the end, he had ended up being pleasantly surprised. This creature would make many things far more convenient. However, after the novelty wore off, Silas began to get more serious. That was because as he moved closer to his destination, he noticed that the number of mammoths in the region was also increasing. But each one had power that still made him shudder. The deeper they went, and the denser the snow became, the larger these mammoths became. Silas steered the direwolf around them, going out of his way much of the time. The mammoths weren't known for their speed, and they didn't seem to be aggressive creatures either, but he had no intention of taking any chances. As night descended and the day waned, Silas had traveled so far that the trees began to grow sparse. The temperature dropped and the snow became harsher. The stamina of the dire wolf felt endless, but after a few hours, Silas realized that this stamina was actually coming from him. It was using up his ether, though in small amounts. It only seemed to be about 1 ether unit per 15 minutes or so. Though, he was probably one of the very few who would say that this was a small price. Now, though, his mind was occupied by other things. He believed he was approaching the Arctic Circle, but now it was a matter of where exactly the Arctic king cobras were. Chapter 242 Rune Sight. Flying Kunai, Bronze. Level, 10, Ability. Pierce, Evolve, increase strength effectiveness by less than 2% for every less than 0.1 units of ether, level up requirement, less than 1 bronzy genes. Durability, 7/10. Flying Kunai, Bronze. Level, 10, Ability. Pierce, Evolve, Flame damage, increase strength effectiveness by less than 2% for every less than 0.1 units of ether, level up requirement, less than 1 bronzy genes. Damage increased by 5%. Durability, 6/10. Flying Kunai, Bronze. Level, 10, Ability. Pierce, Evolve, Dark damage, increase strength effectiveness by less than 2% for every less than 0.1 units of ether, level up requirement, less than 1 bronzy genes. Damage increased by 5%, damage increased by 10% in the night. Durability, 6/10. As Silas continued, he used the excess common genes he collected to upgrade his kunai. But the problem was the durability. It seemed that for a long time, they had been at 10. But the moment they started to dip downward, they did so quickly. Silas still had no idea how to fix them other than rely on someone with a blacksmithing profession of some sort. But not just anyone could fix a weapon of the legendary path like this one. Once durability dipped down to half, the treasure's stats would begin to take a hit as well. So it seemed that his kunai might not last for very long. He also noticed that the kunai with attributes added to them were worse off than the one without attributes. It seemed that maybe this was a double-edged sword that he needed to consider. Silas hesitated, but in the end, he decided to only use his kunai if the situation warranted it. He had plenty of ballista bolts in his madness key, and they were designed for flight as well, so they were likewise easy to control. Of course, the problem with using them was that they weren't nearly as agile as his kunai, so if he wanted to change the direction in the air, he would either need to use less than momentum shift to take a long, curved path. Unfortunately, his telekinesis could now exert more than 200 physical, while the cap of less than momentum shift was only 200. So, there would definitely be some trade-offs. Silas was a bit lost in thought as he moved. Since there was nothing around, once they got to the expanse of the Arctic Circle, Silas realized that he wasn't completely helpless in this situation. After some thought, he summoned the Basilisk King. It was a bit awkward, but after some adjustments, he wrapped the Basilisk King's body around himself. The Basilisk King was quite large, and had a body over 5 meters long. It had some heft to it as well, but since Silas could blast it into a wall with a fist over a month ago, by now this weight wasn't much to him. Plus, it was the dire wolf carrying most of the weight. He just had to keep himself balanced, something the Basilisk King would help him with. He began to slowly communicate with the Basilisk King. He transmitted 2 things. The first was a search pattern he wanted the Basilisk King to use, not to mention an admonishment to remain cautious and avoid beasts where possible. And the second was to protect him. Silas realized that he had to get more used to relying on the Basilisk King for other things. Fusing wasn't the only thing the Basilisk King was useful for. And, unless he let the Basilisk King out more often, how would he finish the Pride quest? With that, Silas' mind turned inward and he began to look toward one of the rewards he had exchanged for in the Nexus. Introduction to Rune, Rune Patterns, and Rune Geometry Secrets. The basilisk king watched Silas enter a state of meditation, its slit eyes flickering as its tongue weaved in and out. Its impression of Silas by this point had changed somewhat, not due to the time they had spent together because that wasn't much, but because Silas had helped it to awaken to more of itself. At the very least, while it wasn't chummy with this human, the urge to bite his head off wasn't there anymore. Favorability, 3/10. In the end, it rested its head on the top of Silas, its golden gaze scanning the region with a murderous light. Why did this human have to always summon it in such cold places? It didn't like this weather at all. Silas' mind appeared on a road. Ahead of him, there were several doors. After a quick look around, he decided that there wasn't much to see here and he might as well just open the first door. As far as he could see, there were 9 total. So he would just take this one step at a time. The moment he opened the door, a rush of information came to his mind. Rune sight. The term was foreign to Silas, but he came to understand it soon thanks to this flood of information. Rune sight was a state of being able to feel and see the runes of the world. This actually didn't refer to being able to see them all, but at least some of them. In fact, the threshold was just being able to see a single one. Runes were divided into tiers, from fragmented to legendary. Of course, this was further divided into the F grade, the E grade, and beyond. This was the first that Silas had heard of the E grade, but this introductory course didn't mention anything beyond it. Further, runes were the language of the universe, and ether was their fuel. Everything in the world was dictated through them. Skills, for example, were circulation methods that used ether pathways as a replacement for runes. This allowed communication with the runes in the environment that elicited certain reactions. A lot of this fundamental information was stuffed into Silas' mind and quickly digested. Much of it were things he had already personally deduced, but this information consolidated it and made it more tangible to his mind. Then, his vision cleared and a world appeared before him. Chapter 243 Stamp. The first thing Silas saw was a key and a lock. What was odd about the key was that it was a blank, and its body looked particularly narrow and thin compared to the bulkiness of the lock. Intuitively, Silas understood, and soon enough, the information he had assimilated with confirmed it. The first step in this trial of sorts was to form a rune that could unlock this lock and make it to the next one. Silas observed the lock, and then looked at the key. His visualization then swallowed up the lock and he began to analyze it. Soon, his expression became a bit weird, because he felt that the solution was too easy. After some thought, he decided to follow through with it. It wasn't like there was a penalty for being wrong. This world was his own personal tutor. However, quickly, he found a problem. How do I form a rune? Until now, he had only ever taken runes from the world around him. The one time he hadn't, the rune had come from the disc. But here, there were no such things. Even when he activated Enchanted Scholar, he couldn't see the rune he needed. He realized then that he had to form the rune he needed, but he wasn't sure exactly how to do that. Maybe. Silas remembered the visualized conception of less than psychedelic punch greater than. Could it be a similar matter here? He tried it, and soon, he felt his charisma and will moving in an odd way. He had never felt it so tangibly before. Telekinesis was much more fluid and amorphous, but in comparison, this felt like chiseling stone, as though he was forcing his will into a fine point and carving out what he wanted in the world. He immediately felt a wave of fatigue, and he also realized that his wisdom was actually holding him back. Usually, he could split his mind with ease, but right now, even if he wanted to, he couldn't even look away from the rune he was forming, let alone split his mind. It took him an entire half-minute to succeed, and the result left him cringing. Not only was his mind fatigued, but the rune he formed looked like a child's scribble. Earth's runes were broken and beaten, covered in chains and cracking. But they still had a majesty to them that felt so much greater than this. This nameless rune looked like a doodle rather than a law of the world. What was more curious about this was that he felt the gluttony seed had moved while he took action. It was all so very odd. Was this really meant to be so difficult? Silas took a breath and moved ahead, fusing the rune to the key and trying to unlock the lock. It slipped in, but when he tried to turn the key, it jammed. Silas frowned. With his visualization, he could see that the rune was correct, but it was too jagged and broken to fit in properly. It was like a misaligned pattern, and even though he had gotten the solution correct, he might as well have slipped in the wrong key regardless. After a moment, Silas chose to use less than mad and enlightenment greater than. Taking advantage of his sitting form, his ability to replenish his mind was much greater. He had only used up about 30% of his stamina, but since he was in the wilderness, he couldn't afford to be too willful. Once he had re-upped, he began to go again. This time, the rune was close, but still not good enough. It wasn't until the third time that the key turned properly, but got jammed after about an eighth of a turn. The fourth try, it spun properly, but just when it was about to unlock, Silas pulled out and entered a state of meditation again. He felt that he could have unlocked it that time, but he wasn't satisfied. He could get it closer, more refined. As he made a fifth attempt, he was beginning to get into the flow of it. It only took about 10 seconds compared to his first 30-second attempt. And it only took up about 10% of his mental stamina as well. He tried again and again, and then again. As he did so, he even began to be capable of thinking of other things. It was odd. Why was being more familiar with the rune the equivalent of making it easier to draw as well? It felt like he was missing something. Technically speaking, even if it took him longer to draw, it should take the same amount of will to draw. Even if there was some change in the wisdom it took up, it couldn't be this drastic. As Silas focused, he realized what was happening. The number of strokes. The first time he drew the rune, he had to press down, lift, correct, and then press down again and again. But by the fifth time, the number of times he had to lift and correct himself was fewer. It was almost like piercing into a veil, but every time he retreated, finding the exact spot to continue became harder and harder. In that case, rather than trying to form the rune one step at a time, shouldn't he instead think of it like a stamp? If he formed the visualized conception all at once, and then pressed it into reality, wouldn't that be the fastest and most perfect method? The trouble was that that was difficult. There was a reason that it wasn't Silas' first choice, and he instead took this path of slow and steady instead. If runes were two-dimensional, it would be fine. But because they were three-dimensional, it was far more difficult. It was like memorizing a three-dimensional puzzle all at once and replicating it in a single instant. But as he drew the rune again and again, he became familiar with it enough that this was quickly becoming a more feasible option. And then, on his eighth attempt, his will suddenly pressed down like an envelope stamp, pressing down its intention into the world. Chapter 244th Street Sign. Silas felt a rush plow through his mind. It felt like a silver bell had just gone off. It was a resonant feeling as though he was listening to the song of the universe. The last time he had felt this way was when he had lost his mind to the barrier in the Slithering Madness dungeon. Now, though, it felt like it was much more under his control. However, that was when something that left Silas speechless happened. He missed. The rune flew through the air and missed the fusion point with the key. It shot past and hit the lock, forcing it to open. With a clean click asterisk, the lock opened and Silas felt a sort of bittersweet feeling. He had focused so much on completing the rune that his control in the end was still lacking. Interestingly enough, he didn't need the key. When he looked through the memories that he had received, he understood something. Usually, you needed a medium to use runes like this, almost like a mage's wand or staff. In this situation, the medium was the key, while the target of the medium was obviously the lock. But Silas had missed it, and by coincidence, he noticed that he didn't need a medium. Or rather, was it? The gluttony seed. I felt it act before, and a small portion of it moved this time as well. I thought it was meaningless, but it seemed that it's far more useful than I thought. It made my telekinesis feel more real, more tangible, and that's what allows it to not need a medium. Interesting. Still, Silas admonished himself. Putting in all the effort to miss in the end wasn't a good thing. Though he had learned something important from this excursion, he had to remember to keep more focus in the future. Just as Silas was about to continue to the next step, he was pushed out of the door. The door faded away as he appeared back on the road. To Silas' surprise, it seemed that he had already passed. That was odd. He was pretty sure that there were dozens more challenges in that door alone. But now it was gone. Silas thought for a moment if he had been scammed, but in the end, he shook his head. That shouldn't be the case. Just as he was about to see what the second door held, though, his expression changed. He felt a spike of pain and immediately realized that it could have only come from his real body. With a thought, he exited the world. The first thing Silas saw when stepping out was a whirlwind of snow. It seemed far denser here and even seemed to have a hint of a blue glow. Silas was shocked because he even noticed that his skin was frighteningly pale right now, even the tips of his fingers were starting to gain a deathly color. He hurriedly covered himself in a layer of ether skin, realizing that much like the volcano, this wasn't a normal environment. This cold was being bolstered by ether. The second thing Silas noticed was that there was an uptick of beasts in the region. It was hard to spot them at first because of their white fur and the backdrop of this world, but Silas felt his hair stand on end when he did. The third thing he noticed was that all of these beasts were headed in the same direction, even ignoring the basilisk king that hadn't noticed them immediately as well. The pain he had felt earlier should have come from the bad state his body was in. He had been careless and almost suffered from frostbite. Luckily, the fact that there was pain was actually a good sign. What he should fear was if he had felt numb. Silas felt his body quickly heating up and he grew serious. There was only one thing that could make so many beasts move in unison like this, a high concentration of ether. It had to either be a dungeon or a portal. Getting closer would be dangerous, but he still urged the dire wolf forward. He remembered his experience in the volcano. Had it not been for the snail, the beasts would have mostly ignored him. If it was a dungeon, when he got close, the beasts would begin to turn their attention to him. But if it was a portal, then they would likely keep rushing ahead while ignoring him. Beasts couldn't enter dungeons, so they usually just settled around it to benefit from the increased ether. But with portals, they would often be tricked into going to the other side even though Earth's ether was thinner than the ether of the ether plane. Judging based on the situation, Silas might be able to tell which it was without approaching too closely. Still, he had to be cautious. This region had exceptionally powerful beasts, and fighting against just one of them might put his life on the line, let alone if several of them came at him at once. However, he had a trump card, that being his fusion with the Basilisk King. With how quickly he could do it now, it wouldn't be too late to activate the process once something went wrong. The dire wolf continued to rush forward and Silas didn't slow its speed by more than 50% or so. The density of beasts was quickly increasing and soon Silas saw what they were all rushing toward. A portal. Silas' eyes narrowed. He wondered what part of Earth this was aimed toward, but something else steered his thoughts away a moment later. All the portals he had seen until now were manned by the government or its opposers. But this one. It looked as though the beasts were just freely crossing over to the other side. There wasn't anyone fighting against them at all. This situation doesn't look good. Although Silas said this, he was quite indifferent. He didn't plan on sticking his neck out, especially not when these beasts were so dangerous. But that was when he saw a sign sticking out of the store. It was a street sign with a blue background and bright white words. But by now, it was so covered in snow that it was easy to overlook. Below the street name, there was a range of house numbers. Looking at the combination of the two, Silas' pupils couldn't help but constrict. He had seen that street name and those numbers a million times in the past. That was definitely the street Cassare's parents lived on. Chapter 245 People. As far as he was aware, Cassare had moved away from home after high school. But her parents hadn't. In fact, they often came over to Silas' home to spend time with his parents. Their families were close enough that he could call them aunt and uncle if he had a different personality. It was just that Cassare had never come with them in all these years, and neither did Silas go over when his parents went to visit. Silas hesitated for a moment, but he knew that he had already made a decision. The objective truth was that he was making this decision based on emotion, but that didn't mean that there wouldn't be other benefits. This portal was here, and yet there was no sign of the government. Much like Paradise, this was an open region without influence. And unlike Paradise, there was much greater potential here. Paradise was a small city, but Alderaan was more of a mid-sized city, though it was close to York City, a large cosmopolitan not much unlike Lone Star. Viridian University was located in Alderaan, and Alderaan was a city that pretty much surrounded the existence of the top one university. It could be said that Alderaan was more like a gated community. It's just that it had grown so large because the university had its hands in too many pots. While this city wasn't nearly as large as Lone Star, it was a suburban utopia with a high concentration of elites. The prestige of the #1 university in the world wasn't something that could be explained in a few words. But that was also why there was a nagging thought in the back of Scylla's mind. How could the government allow such an important place to be overrun? It made sense in Paradise's case because it was so insignificant in the grand scheme. But could they really be so short-handed here? Let's go. Scylla's gaze became sharp and he adjusted himself to a peak. Before he understood if the government truly wasn't here, he would have to check to see what was on the other side of his portal. The dire wolf rushed forward and Scylla's visualization remained sharp. He paid attention to every slight change as he placed the Basilisk King back into the hibernation realm. Surprisingly, he got to the other side with great ease. The beasts didn't mind him at all, and he felt himself relax slightly. Technically speaking, there was no reason for the beasts to target him more than any one of the other beasts around him. Usually, they reacted so poorly because he was entering their territory. This was a similar reason to why they would stop him from entering dungeons as well. After all, they would settle down around the region and call it home. In this case, they all had the same goal and he wasn't obstructing any of them, so there was likewise no reason for them to target him in specific. Now that I think about it, the aggressiveness of the beast seems to all be artificially crafted. The dire wolf dove through the portal and the sights on the other side made Scylla's expression flicker. There really was no government presence in this region as he thought, and as a result, what had once been a suburban paradise had been turned into, well, it couldn't exactly be called a hell. Much of the damage was caused by portals alone, not the beasts. They had yet to grow powerful enough to do things like plowing buildings down or cracking paved roads. Well, at least not most of them, and certainly not casually. However, windows were knocked out, doors collapsed, beasts roamed in and out of homes as though they were the true owners and many more left into the distance, spreading out as though in search of something more. Scylla was taken aback. None of this made any sense. There didn't even seem to be real signs of a struggle. It was as though the government had just directly given up on this place. There has to be a reason for this. After having this thought, Scylla urged the dire wolf forward. Before he did anything, he had to check Cassere's family home. It didn't take long to reach there at all. The street sign had already been swallowed and spit out, so the portal wasn't far from their region to begin with. Scylla's worry was that the portal had already swallowed even their home up as well, but the street was a long one and the portal wasn't large enough just yet for things to get to that point. In fact, he made it to the house in just a few seconds. Without entering, his visualization swept through first. On his way over here, he had done the same but he had yet to find any people. It was likely that the area had long been evacuated. Maybe the government knew this would happen and decided to concentrate all their resources on York City. Lucius had been able to guess where a portal would appear, so who is to say that the government can't do the same? If they knew it would happen here in advance, then maybe they already vacated the region. After some thought, Scylla decided to enter the home. Maybe there were some clues that he could pick up on. His visualization gave him a clear understanding of everything in a 30-minute range, but the issue was that it was like looking at a screen. No human could take in everything on a screen at once, more things were bound to be in the periphery. Ultimately, he was still more used to scanning things with his own eyes. He walked by the broken gate and entered the home. There were some beasts scurrying around, scavenging food from the refrigerator and building dens in the carpet. But these seemed to just be small creatures that didn't bother with Scylla's, and even outright avoided him. Scylla's didn't find anything immediately, so after some hesitation, he went upstairs. What he wanted to know was where he could find them. Now that he knew that Cassere's parents weren't necessarily in danger, he could relax. So his intentions had turned to another task. If he could link up with Cassere, that would make many things much easier. Then, they could start on the next phase of their plan. But he needed to know where she was. He didn't find anything in her parents' bedroom and was about to leave when his feet paused. His head turned toward a door with a FCK off sign hanging on it. Obviously, only Cassere could have such a thing. His hand reached forward and he was about to open the door when his gaze flickered. His visualization caught something near its edges. People. Chapter 246 York. Silas didn't move and focused on that region. This experience of having to enter Casseray's childhood home and risk himself taught him that there was definitely much more he needed to learn about controlling his visualization. This seemed like the perfect opportunity to try it. Quote ellipsis. Can't give this up without doing anything. Calm down. There are some extremely powerful animals on the other side of that gate. If we're too casual about it, we can die. The organization isn't going to allow that sort of thing. Our top priority is. The man stopped talking, shaking his head. He couldn't say something like that out loud no matter how safe the situation seemed. Let's finish putting up the defensive perimeter and call it a day. The group moved, carrying battering rams with them. They stood before a house, aimed it toward a corner of its foundation, and then rammed it forward. Silas' expression flickered. The entire house crumbled as though they had set up an on-site detonation. How is that possible? He had seen a lot of stuff in this world already. But much like he had said earlier, he had yet to see anything capable of this level of destruction. Was the battering ram they carried really so powerful? Or was there something that he was missing? If such power hit him, he wouldn't even have a corpse left. The only saving grace was that all four of them had to use it together. They had to synchronize their movements, and it was laborious to move from place to place. They often took breaks in between, and considering what Silas assumed about their stats, that battering ram had to be at least 500 pounds or more for the four of them to struggle like this. What he was most disappointed in was their caution. After the first near slip-up, they hadn't said anything else interesting. But they were coming closer. They'll be knocking down this house after this one. I don't have much time. Silas stopped hesitating and entered Casseray's room. He didn't stalk around, he had too much pride for that. Instead, he focused completely on finding the clues he needed. Whether subconsciously or not, he had avoided news about Casseray. He had no idea what she was doing in her life, and he was the last type of person to have social media, so he didn't keep tabs on her there either. But, he had been in her room before, and it seemed that nothing much had changed. The only difference was that instead of metal rock boy bands being copied and pasted into every corner, she had toned down a bit. The room was quite elegant and clean, though definitely more so thanks to Casseray's mother than her, that was for sure. Unless Casseray had changed, he bet whichever room she lived in now had a pile of used underwear in one corner at the very least. One might expect this pile of underwear to at least be girlish, but nope. The last time Silas had been here there had been 10 boxer briefs for every one set of panties. Silas found himself smiling beside himself. It wasn't that Casseray didn't like to dress like a woman. She certainly did. It was just that she only put in that effort on very rare occasions. Otherwise, she might as well have been a boy fully cosplaying as a beautiful woman. She certainly had the beautiful part down, but she was lacking in the womanly aspects. Surprisingly, Silas found what he needed after a few seconds. On a pin-up board over her bed, there was an acceptance letter to York University. It was a bit odd because the acceptance letter had a dagger through it rather than the usual push pin. But that was quite like Casseray. York University, huh? York University might not have been Viridian, but it was still a top 30 university in the country, and top 200 in the world. One could certainly get an excellent education from there, and Silas had once guest lectured on their campus as well. She should have graduated already. It's doubtful she had the patience to get a master's, but the odds that she would have settled down in a place near there is high. Casseray should also be quite focused on recruiting as well, and there's no better place to do so than her old stomping grounds. There will certainly be elites in York University. If her parents were evacuated earlier, then they would meet up with her there as well. Silas made his deductions and chose to leave. It was hard to tell how much advance notice the family had, especially since the carnage the beasts that had snuck in had left. Silas wasn't a tracking expert, so he had no method of judging exactly what happened. But there was only one car in the garage, and that was a good sign. If they had only evacuated after the portal descended, there was no way that their car would still work with how close by it was. Time to go. The group had already finished with the second house and were on their way here. Silas still wasn't sure about exactly what they were doing, but he knew that he would need to do something about it. If he wanted to freely use this portal, then whatever these people were up to was definitely a detriment to him. And the information they had was even more important to him. He just had to strike when they were the most tired. Casseret's room's window faced the backyard. He slid it open and grabbed above him, scaling to the roof. The house was quite large, so this particular mini-mansion had 3 peaks and several valleys on the roof alone. They were more than enough for him to hide from sight. Silas crept forward until he was as close to the group of 4 as he could be. His gaze sharpened the moment they began to swing their battering ram. Chapter 247 Armor. Christina Sage, F+, level 7, Sean O'Connor, FF, level 7, Brian Ferlin, F+, level 8, Lucas Sheen, FF, level 9. Looking at their levels, Silas was partially stunned. When he saw their stats, his expression became even weirder. Had he become too used to fighting it out with behemoths? He shook his head. Not everyone could be a level 15 monster capable of taking his life with a thought if he lagged for but a moment. Even so, that didn't mean he planned on letting his guard down. Just as the 4 moved with a plan to swing, his gaze flashed. Less than astral bind greater than. In that moment, he cast it 4 times over, using quite a large amount of his ether for just these 4. However, he felt that it was worth it. Of the group, only Lucas managed to break free of it, but Silas was already prepared for that as one of his kunai was already falling, while Lucas wasn't even aware of where the enemy was just yet. Bang! The battering ram relied on its momentum to slam into the foundation of the home. Silas felt his feet slip out from under him, but he was already ready for this. A fall from a few meters wasn't enough to do anything to him with his current stats. Because the battering ram's trajectory was thrown off by their freeze, they couldn't control it properly and the entire weight fell into Lucas to bear. By the time he realized it was best if he let go and cut his losses, Silas was already right above his head. He didn't even end up needing to use his kunai, his fist colliding with Lucas' face. Teeth flew and blood spurted. Silas held back just enough to not kill Lucas in a single blow just in case, but that didn't stop him from driving a foot into Lucas' hip and shattering it much like he had done with a certain shieldman in the past. He landed on the ground nimbly as the house collapsed around him. His visualization immediately picked up several bits of debris that could fall toward him. He flicked aside those light enough to be targeted by his visualization, but he quickly realized that this was too troublesome. He realized now why it was he wasn't able to casually take in everything within the range of his visualization. While his range was 30 meters, there was only so much his wisdom could allow him to focus on at most. If he wanted to gaze at the entire region, it would likely be impossible unless he had a wisdom in the several thousands. Maybe even that was being too conservative. He changed his approach and acted quickly. With a touch, the battering ram burst into a rain of ash. Then, he slapped out with 2 palms, pushing 2 more away from the falling debris before turning a fist toward the skies. Bang! A flying piece of wood was sent tumbling away by him. Then, in a swift motion, he picked Lucius up by his ankle and abandoned the last of the 4, diving out of the way. Silas rolled as Lucas screamed out in pain. His body was in terrible condition already after Silas' actions. Now, his situation was even worse. However, Silas didn't have the time to mind him. He stripped all of them naked. Before, he had no choice but to destroy the battering ram because the group was frozen, including their muscles. As such, they were still holding on to the treasure. If he didn't find a way to force them to let go, then he would have to move their weight along with it, and that was beyond him right now. As for why he was stripping them naked, it was because he had no way of knowing if they had any other trump cards on their person. After he killed Azrael, he had come to understand that raw power and stats weren't everything in this world. He should know considering how many times he had almost died not because of stupidity, but due to being entirely unable to account for every single variable there was. There were too many skills, too many treasures, too many potential trump cards and changes that could happen in battle. Christina's pupils constricted in fear when she saw Silas stripping him down. There seemed to only be one reason a man would do this to a woman, but Silas didn't even seem to notice her gender at all. Compared to her emotions, Lucas was in the worst situation. Having your pants forcefully taken off with a shattered hip was something he never wanted to experience again. In fact, he directly passed out from the pain. Once he had all of their clothes and their items, Silas looked around. Somehow, these four were able to force houses to collapse and never suffered a beast attack for it. One would have thought that at least once by now, the noise alone would bring over curious animals, which would inevitably lead to battles. But Silas found out quite quickly why that was. Basic beast ward, F, treasure, level 10, become a part of nature, a passing breeze, or a fluttering leaf. Beasts with wisdom beneath 100 cannot sense you outside of 10 meters. It can mess with the senses to that extent. With the snail being an exception, from what he had seen, beasts tended to have pretty low wisdom even if their intelligence was high. Even the basilisk king's wisdom wasn't even 20. This is very, very useful. Silas immediately put one around his neck, only for it to shatter. His lip twitched. Out of habit, he always picked up treasures with his telekinesis just in case. He couldn't trust his scorned wrap to keep anything intact if it could get away with destroying it. What he didn't expect was that even this auxiliary item would count as one that he wasn't allowed to have. It seemed that it counted as armor. Chapter 248 Coincidence. Silas shook his head and put the other two beast ward necklaces away. He was already used to being screwed over by these things, so it was fine even if he didn't gain such a benefit. Luckily, they had knocked down the house while still having him on, so the noise still hadn't attracted many beasts over. But it was a matter of time before they started roaming in this area. Silas crouched down and looked them all in the eye. I know that you can move now, but I would advise that you don't, he spoke casually to Christina and Sean. He didn't bother with Lucius because he knew that he was the most injured of them. Even if Silas paid him, Lucius would be unwilling to make a move right now. As for Christina and Sean, they were a bit injured from his attack to get them out of range, but not to the point of not being able to do anything. However, when two kunai appeared at their necks, they didn't dare to move so casually anymore. They had no idea how Silas had done it, but he destroyed that battering ram with a single touch. How could they know about the curse of the scorned wraps? To them, Silas was just a monster. With Silas' words, the last thoughts they had of rebellion flew out of their minds. Now, are you from Legacy or the government? They froze, but eventually, piece by piece, and even with some madness coercion, they were forced to answer. Soon, Silas got a picture of what was happening here. He hadn't saved two of them out of the kindness of his heart. He only needed several to corroborate what was happening. He was educated enough to know that torture wasn't the best method of getting information out of people. Often, it could breed false confessions, or someone with just enough presence of mind could lie to you under duress and then you would be screwed to act properly. Instead, Silas found that the best way was to force them to tell the same story, separating them so that they couldn't communicate. That way, they wouldn't dare to lie because it would mean their lives. If their companions didn't lie the same exact way, then wouldn't they be exposing themselves? This aside, it turned out that Silas was correct. There was a clash planned here between the government and Legacy. However, things went awry because there seemed to also be a third party involved. These three didn't know who the third party was, but the government ended up evacuating this area over half a month ago, before this portal even appeared. In the end, this region became a stalemated one, while the real battlegrounds were in the shadows of York City. While things seemed peaceful over there, there were many undercurrents that took place in the depths of the night and away from the public eye. This left one question, though. If so much was triggered by the appearance of this portal, then why were they so free to act here alone without anything else happening? The answer to that was pretty simple: more portals had appeared. There was one that appeared in the heart of York City, and the government had obviously been ready for this because they immediately sealed it. There was a second one that appeared in the heart of Viridian, and that was immediately taken over by Legacy, leading to a stalemate in the region as both had control over valuable resources in the region. But as though that wasn't enough chaos, there was a third portal that appeared aside from this one. It was said, though, that this portal wasn't opened naturally, but was rather the effect of a city lord establishing a connection with the ether plane. What was troublesome about this portal was that it was on an island, so it was difficult to get to, and there was too much going on for others to pay attention to it. But then, yet another portal appeared in the water itself. This led to an odd phenomenon that caused the waters to be especially turbid. Even if the most modern of boats was used, the death rate would be over 70%, and that wasn't considering the beasts that were flooding the region. Then, one also had to consider the fact that modern boats no longer worked normally. The only way to cross the ocean now was by either using an oaring boat or finding two portals that were nearby. And in this case, it was precisely because there were so many portals around that the usual boats didn't work. This inevitably led to chaos. Now, there was an island in the heart of York City that was being controlled by an unknown city lord that no one could get to, a portal in another borough of York City that was under the control of the government, a third portal in Veridine under the control of Legacy, and in the end, the portal in this small town was practically forgotten. There were no resources in this portal, just an endless tundra. On top of that, the beasts were far too powerful and dangerous, whether it were the mammoths or the Arctic king cobras. It was only natural that this was the one portal that had ended up being neglected. There were far too many portals popping up everywhere on Earth, and it could be said that the vast majority of them ended up abandoned and ignored. The end of the trial had simply come too soon for everyone to be prepared. In the end, Legacy just ended up sending some of their weaker lackeys over to see if they could form a basic perimeter. It was a casual effort on their part and they didn't even really expect to get much out of it. If they succeeded, then good. If they failed, they didn't care much either. All of this said, Silas couldn't help but worry. A city lord had forcefully opened a connection to the ether plane. Was it a coincidence that this was also the region Kasari called home? Chapter 249 Basic Barrier Chains. When Silas heard that so many portals had appeared in this small region, he wasn't sure what to think. But he knew that he at least had to go and check the region out. However, going now, considering the situation, wouldn't be smart. Going now versus going later wouldn't make a large difference. If Kasari was truly already on the verge of dying, his current self couldn't change much of that. She had survived 3 months on her own before she found him, and she had survived this long without him, she would be able to hold on now. He had come here for one specific thing, the Arctic King Cobra, and he had yet to find it. Only after he slayed this beast and completed the prerequisite he needed to clear his quest would he continue onward. As for the rest, these three gave him some assurance. At the very least, this portal wouldn't be actively pursued by any one group anytime soon. At least not seriously. After these four failed, it was unlikely that Legacy would send anyone in the short term. And it was likely that the government would be just as casual about the matter as they were. In fact, if Silas was correct, it was more likely that the government wouldn't send anyone. That was because compared to Legacy, their situation was much more dire. They were in control of York City, and they had two portals not under their control, both of which they couldn't even get to. Silas put the odds of them coming to near zero. After he reached this point in his thoughts, he killed the trio before they could even understand what was happening. It might have been cruel, but it was necessary. He didn't want them going back and reporting his existence because someone intelligent would certainly be able to deduce that he had come from the other side of the portal. If they guessed that, then in the future, rather than two enemies, Lucius' encampment would have to face 3 or potentially 4. Right now, Silas needed Lucius' situation to remain as stable as possible. That was the only way for him to continue to take advantage of this situation. As for these few corpses, he would toss them to the beasts to devour. Silas quickly pulled the 4th corpse out from under the rubble and then threw all of their bodies into a pack of snow wolves. After this, he left the region. Silas was still going around somewhat like a headless chicken. Even as the sun began to set, he had yet to find any of the Arctic king cobras he was looking for. He had mostly come to this region based on a tip from that introduction he read in the Nexus, so he didn't have any precise information about them other than the general location. He even wondered if he should return to the tundra now that he knew there was nothing to worry about on this side. Maybe it would be easier to find them there. One step at a time. As Silas rode on the back of the dire wolf, he checked the storage devices of the group he had killed. As expected, he mostly found some ether replenishment and healing elixirs. But what intrigued him the most was what they had prepared to form their barrier. It was a linked chain that ran several kilometers from end to end. It looked quite flimsy, so much so that Silas felt that he could use it as a whip if he so desired. But it had 2 important functions. The first was that it stopped the flow of ether from expanding outward. That would make the portal far harder to detect for beasts that had already left its range. Of course, that would only work on this side of the portal, so beasts would still be attracted from the other side. The second ability was that over time, he could use this ether that it absorbed to form a barrier. What was beautiful about this treasure was that because the chains were so small and unassuming, they were easy to ignore. So they could passively absorb ether over a long period of time while still letting beasts through. Once it reached an appropriate threshold, it could form a dome that would keep all of the beasts sealed inside. This saturating period would take about 3 days. Basic barrier chains, F+ treasure. Level 10. Surround a portal on the non-ether plane side with these chains and bury them into the ground. In 3 days, it will form a barrier. Defense, 10 million. Replenishment rate, 2 million per hour. Silas remembered seeing the barrier Kasari paid for and it had double the defense, but half the replenishment rate. It seemed that this barrier traded upfront strength for faster recovery. And more importantly than that, it was capable of replenishing itself with the help of the ether being pumped from the barrier. That left a question, though. Why set up the barrier on this side and not in the tundra instead? It seemed that it would be more convenient the other way around. But the description clearly specified that it had to be on this side. It made Silas wonder why. Silas felt his heart tremble and he looked to the side immediately. He sensed something, an evolution opportunity for the Basilisk King. By this point, he had traveled out of the suburban community. This direction was in the opposite way to Viridian, and away from York City as well. Though there was a suburban paradise, there was also a long stretch of ocean waters and cabins in this region. Often, in the summer months, families would travel up here to bask in nature. As such, there wasn't much difference between this region here and the wilderness of the ether plane. Silas chose this direction because it was both away from those powers and because he felt that beasts would be most likely to settle here. He had only planned on traveling a few more kilometers before turning back, but it seemed that he might not have to. Arctic King Cobra, FFF. Level, 7. Physical, 220. Mental, 291. Will, 253. Chapter 250 Domain, Arctic King Cobra, FFF. Level, 7. Physical, 220. Mental, 291. Will, 253. The creature was truly beautiful. It had alternating scales of pearly white and blue, and steely, slit sapphire eyes. When its hood opened up, a pattern of embroidery could be seen as if it had been branded with a sky blue rune. Silas was quite familiar with the hobby of snake breeding. Opening batches of eggs and checking what unique patterns you could get from selective breeding was something that he also liked to do. Though he mostly chose function over form, trying to research venom, he was familiar with the process nonetheless. This mutated cobra race, though, was on another level. He had truly never seen a snake so beautiful, but it was also hard to match this level of beauty when this snake was quite literally emitting motes of light. Its power was also truly exceptional. It was only level 7, but those stats were off the chart. Just standing here, Silas felt a great deal of pressure. This beast was clearly on the same level as the mammoth race and the snail he had seen before. But they also seemed to have an extra aura, a hidden strength that Silas couldn't quite grasp. Was that the path of the Mancer? It felt like this beast was more dangerous than even its already outrageous stats seemed to suggest. If not for madness, he wouldn't even have the right to sense its stats at all with how high its mental was. Without hesitation, Silas jumped off the back of the dire wolf and activated his beast totem in an instant. This was only a level 7 Arctic King Cobra and wasn't enough to clear his quest, but it was a good foundation. Now that he had less than Master Scouting greater than, it was even more worthwhile than normal to take his time and feel out this race of creatures. The Arctic King Cobra hissed before it suddenly trembled. A pair of slit, golden eyes appeared behind Silas and the hood of the cobra slammed closed as it backed away. However, realizing that it wouldn't be able to make much of an escape in this situation, it put on a brave front. Then, as though it had been provoked by something, it lashed out. Its tail whipped and a scythe of crystalline blue took shape. Immediately, Silas saw through several things. 1. Because of the distance between this location and the portal, the ether was concentrated enough for skills to work, but not concentrated enough for skills to display the usual level of power. And, second, Chilling Scythe, F+, skill, weakened. Damage, 100 -80%. Special damage, 20 sec for 5 seconds. Attribute, Ice Poison. Silas saw this screen in his periphery the moment the ether circulated, and he realized that less than Master Scouting didn't just allow him to document skills after they had been cast, but at least with the influence of madness, he could analyze a skill the moment it was triggered instead of after it was already cast. This was huge. So long as he had the reaction speed to take this into consideration, this could very well save his life at a critical moment. He activated less than solidify with the thought. He wasn't in a rush to kill this beast, he wanted to feel out all of its trump cards to get a solid understanding. The scythe collided with his shield and it immediately spread in a wide net of ice. Blue runes lit up like a curse mark of sorts and he could sense that his shield was now experiencing more damage every second. Attribute Ice Poison. There's strong, lingering damage as a result. Only after the 5 seconds were up did the runes fade away, but in that time, the Cobra had already sent out another 3 chilling scythes. This was clearly its most confident base attack. However, it seemed shocked to see that it wasn't working at all. Silas' beast totem weakened even its skills. As such, what should have been 100 damage plus an additional 100 damage spread over 5 seconds had instead become 30 damage. While his beast totem didn't seem to affect the ice poison damage, this was still huge. Even after 4 consecutive attacks, it wasn't until several more seconds passed that the corrosive damage of the ice poison finally caused less than solidify to crumble. This is very convenient, but I can also see how it could become a crutch. Silas didn't think that this was a completely positive thing. If one day his scouting didn't work, or if he couldn't calculate fast enough, then he might end up screwing himself over. However, he couldn't deny that now that he didn't have to just cross his fingers and hope for the best that things were far easier to handle. I'll have to press it a bit. I won't learn anything if it just uses the same attack again and again. 3 ballista bolts appeared high in the skies and suddenly drilled down toward the Cobra in 3 separate directions. At the same time, Silas summoned another solidify, watching sharply. The Arctic King Cobra roared and a pair of ice-covered fangs flashed. At that moment, a cone of frosty poison surged out from it, forming a dome of blue runes. The moment the ballista bolts came in contact with them, they froze over and the sky blue curse marks began to ripple over their bodies. The arrows continued forward, but their speed was quickly plummeting. Just as they were about to get within range to pierce the Cobra's body, they crumbled into a rain of blue ash. It was also in that very instant that the cursed blue runes had completely saturated the bodies. Arctic Howl, FF, skill. Defense, 600 -80%. Attribute, Ice Poison. Silas continued to fight with the Cobra, weaving in and out and pulling out its trump cards one after another. There didn't seem to be anything to worry about, just as he truly got the intention to kill it. Arctic King's Domain, FFF, skill. Silas' hair stood on end as a violent whirlwind of ether poured in from the surroundings. Chapter 251 Dissecting. Blue runes raced across the ground and in that moment, the soft soil cracked as though it had completely frosted over. Over the course of this battle, Silas had realized that the methods of this Cobra weren't truly like ice at all. Instead, it was like the ice had truly become a poison. The way it interacted with things was beyond just the use of cold, but rather more so like the cold had become a virus that could permeate through the body and even treasures alike. In this way, it was more fearsome than the ice attribute that Silas had faced after escaping the volcano, albeit also less flexible. The pure attacks that the Cobra had were lacking and were often only made potent by continuous, recurring damage. However, its ability to control the area, defend itself, and break down attacks that came for it, was truly special. And now, this seemed to be its strongest ability. Silas hurried to get out of the range of the blue runes approaching him. At the same time, he tried to digest what this skill was capable of. Until now, he was only reading stripped-down versions of the skills. He didn't want the descriptions or any of their fancy lore, he just wanted the damage and defense, plus what they actually did. But now, this one didn't seem to be nearly so straightforward. Arctic King's Domain, FFF, skill. The unfurling of a king's hood should be the sign of great danger. However, in the case that these pitiful worms do not understand your might, show them what it truly means to be a king. Form a domain of ice poison that damages your enemy and strengthens yourself. For every additional meter of range, use 1 ether unit. Can be maintained for 60 seconds. Special damage, 30 per second. Special buff, plus 50% to all ice poison skills used. Scylla's heart skipped a beat. Could be maintained for 60 seconds and it did 30 damage a second. Didn't that mean 1800 damage from just a single cast? Worse than that, even if the cobra failed to trap him in its domain, it still had a personal buff that it could use that would cancel out a lot of Scylla's own debuff to it. However, as Scylla's accelerated backward, staying out of the range of the swarm of blue runes being etched across the ground, he realized that the cobra was quickly overdrawing itself. By the time Scylla's had left a 10-meter range, the cobra swayed and then collapsed. Its domain flickered and then vanished slowly afterward. Scylla's eyes narrowed. It ran out of ether. Indeed, he had pushed the cobra quite far and brought out several of its skills. Even with such high intelligence and mental, it couldn't possibly go on forever. Even the weakest skills required at least 0.5 ether units to activate. This cobra had around 300 intelligence, and most of its skills cost 1 ether unit. So that was only about 30 casts total. The fact it could expand its domain to almost 10 meters before it fell short was already impressive enough. And this is only level 7. If it wasn't suppressed by my beast totem, then I don't even know if I would be able to defeat it on my own. At least not without blitzing it. Scylla's had learned long ago to not play with his food. If he could defeat an enemy quickly, that was what he should do. But this time, he had purposely extended the battle to make more note of the cobra's ability, and he had almost suffered for it despite having the clear upper hand. After a while, the domain completely vanished. Now that the dust had settled, he understood what was going on. The tip that had allowed him to come here was one that he read in the Nexus. That tip was about the venom pouch of the king cobra and how it could be used as a weapon. That one had been for a level 8 Arctic king cobra, so if that beast had been anywhere near this one, the person who killed it had to be an elite expert. Scylla's could only slot this thought into the back of his mind. He couldn't think about it for now. What he was far more concerned about was the pouch itself. With insight having reached level 7, he could feel the path forward for the Basilisk King with far more clarity. The venom pouches of the Arctic King Cobra weren't meant for the Basilisk King to swallow. The path of venom wasn't meant for the Basilisk King. Instead, what he could do was use these pouches to suppress and remove the poison that marred the corpses of the mammoths. Then, he could use them to help the Basilisk King evolve. It was a bit tricky, and it required rune control, apparently. The venom of the Arctic King Cobra was very special as it combined 3 principles. Those 3 were cold, poison, and a similar kingly aura to the one the Basilisk King had. When their venom was used, it would forcefully invade its target, dominating it and flooding it with its cold. Whereas normal cold would start from the outside, slowly spreading, this cold acted far more like poison, piercing as deeply as possible and then working outward. The kingly aura of this path of poison was what Scylla's needed. That was because he could use it to suppress other poisons and control them. If he could comprehend the special runes of the venom pouch, then he would be able to lay out a clear path of progression for the Basilisk King. And much the same way, he would be able to help himself. Of course, he would have to be cautious, but if there was anything in this world that he was confident in, it was dissecting snakes. A ballista bolt fell from the skies and pierced through the head of the unconscious cobra. Then, Scylla's brought it into the madness key. He would have to see if he could find that level 10 target now. Chapter 252 Cycle. The intuition that came from his legendary path skill was quite shocking to Scylla's, but it was also a bit uncomfortable. As he continued to look around for more Arctic King Cobras, he couldn't help but feel slightly unsettled. It was a lot like how he felt about his will state. It felt uncomfortable that the system could impact even such a thing, and now it seemed like it could rewire even his brain, making him understand things that he had never understood before. There was no reason for him to understand how to make use of runes like this. His skill in this regard was still infantile. Everything about this world left him feeling like this somewhat. The reconstructed clones of extinct beasts, the spawned workers of villages, and now this. It was hard to not feel as though everything was being manipulated behind the scenes to make a person feel as though little was actually in their control. Ignorance was bliss. You could only grasp everything through absolute power. But what if you were stuck in the middle of the two? Were you just supposed to wallow in despair? And how long would it take to get there if your goal was to finally grasp everything in your hands? Would you even be able to get there at all? Silas continued to look around, but he found absolutely nothing. It seemed as though this cobra was either the only one that had come or it was the only one in this region. After some thought, Silas found a cabin, cleared it out, and then locked himself in its cellar. Once this was done, he took out the cobra's corpse after lighting the fireplace. He sat near it and then slowly began to use a dagger he had found in a legacy member's spatial device to begin carving into the creature. As expected, the constitution of this beast was exceptional. As he slowly worked, carving into its body, he began to wonder about something. What separates a strong Mansa affinity from a weak one? The affinity of a Mansa is often decided by their class, their comprehension, and their race. Silas' eyes narrowed. This wasn't exactly the answer he was looking for, but it was an answer nonetheless. When he thought of Mansas, he thought of fire, water, earth, or maybe more shocking elements like darkness or lightning. He had more thoughts than he cared to admit about the latter two and those that fell into their categories. The only reason that he had ultimately chosen the Arctic King Cobra could be summarized in a single word: time. He didn't have the time to wait around, hoping to find the very best Mansa path to follow. So, the moment he found a beast that was a Mansa, he pounced on it. In truth, Silas didn't know just how right he was to make this choice. The difficulty of his quest wasn't just in how hard it would be to kill these beasts, but how hard they were to find. Not just any creature could be considered a Mansa. Even those that had special elemental ether might not be. It was a special categorization. Of course, another reason he was so eager to take this route was likewise because of his beast totem. Not only was the Arctic King Cobra the first Mansa he had found, but it was also the creature he could most easily defeat as well. And after fighting it, he realized just how right he was. If all Mansas were this powerful, the current him had no right to fight them, especially not if the first leg of the chain quest required him to kill a level 10. How does ice poison stack up to other Mansa paths? All Mansa paths are created equal. Silas took a breath and shook his head. He had already seen that this was the case based on the first answer, but he had ended up wasting the necessary genes this time anyway. That was a bit disappointing, but at least now he knew for sure instead of just guessing around. Like it had said, the Mansa path wasn't important. It was what you used to supplement it that was. His comprehension, his race, his class. All of these would be important cogs to the wheel. Seeing how defensively powerful the ice poison Mansa path was, though, Silas felt that it was perfect for him. What he lacked the most in right now was defense. Unlike others, he couldn't wear fancy armors or stat-laden robes and such. He had to rely on his own flesh and blood. Aside from maybe Earth itself, Silas probably couldn't end up with a better path forward. Silas sucked in a cold breath as the temperature suddenly plummeted. He had finally gotten down to the venom sac of the cobra, peeling through layers of thick, meaty, and extraordinarily fatty flesh. The moment he saw the slightly blue-tinted flesh sac, he felt as though someone had reached out and grabbed his throat. He activated Enchanted Scribe, and he saw all sorts of blue runes floating in the air. They latched onto the heat and suffocated it, smothering it from all sides. Even the fire of the fireplace seemed to be slowly tinging blue, but what was odd was that the flames weren't going out. Instead, the embers were doing something odd. Every time the embers separated from the main body, they would burst apart and become a rain of blue fairy dust. But Silas knew that if he touched this dust, he would be truly screwed over. Just a single wisp could infect him with those blue runes. Even so, watching it like this felt particularly magical. When the sparkling blue fairy dust hit the wooden floorboards, ice spread like cracked cobwebs, racing across the ground before the energy gave out and another speck followed it. It felt like Silas was experiencing a cycle of life, one of ice, poison, and decay. Chapter 253 Pouch. Silas didn't bother cutting the entire sack. If the effect was so potent now, who was to say what would happen when the rest of it came out to play? Instead, he felt around slowly, observing the runes, watching how they interacted with others, and piecing together how it was that he might be able to help the Basilisk King. He sat there in silence for hours. Every time his stamina ran out, he would run less than mad and enlightenment in perfect stillness for a few minutes before going back at it again. The ice poison rune was extraordinarily complicated. In this particular case, it seemed to be formed of 12 parts. The first part was cold, the second was rigidity, the third was piercing, the fourth was needling, the fifth was cancer, the sixth was fragmentation, the seventh was surrounding, the eighth was fearlessness, the ninth was sublimation, the 10th was suppression, the 11th was separation, and the 12th was oppression. These 12 names were probably meaningless to everyone but Silas. And even for Silas, they barely had subtle differences that differentiated them. For example, piercing and needling were two that he had thought were the same thing when he first started. So were fearlessness and oppression, and so was surrounding and cancer. However, the more he observed, the more he felt that there were subtle differences that had to be outlined. Piercing was deep and singular, while needling was numerous and shallow. Cancer fed on the energy of an item and used it to grow, while surrounding was a deployment of how that stolen energy was used. Fearlessness reversed an energy's tendency to go from areas of low concentration to high, instead forcing the runes to do the opposite, while oppression was an act against that concentration of energy itself. Because of this, Silas had gone from thinking that there were just 2 or 3 runes that made up the ice poison rune, to thinking that it was 5, then 7, all the way to his current estimates. It wasn't until several hours passed without him deciphering any more that he fully comprehended it all. Finally, he understood. If he wanted to help extract the poison from the body of the mammoth, he needed to first decide which of the runes that he would need, then he would need to replicate them. I think I will need suppression, separation, oppression, and sublimation. Suppression would stop the poison from fighting back, separation would allow him to break it down into pieces without it acting like a single whole, oppression would make that process easier, while sublimation would move it into the easiest phase to extricate it. Now, he just needed a method of how. After some thought, Silas used less than mad and enlightenment again and returned to his peak strength. He wanted to attack this with the very best that he had. Once his state was adjusted to his peak, he took out the mammoth corpse. It was in the same exact state that it had been in back then. The good thing about the madness key, although he couldn't put living things into it, was that it kept everything perfectly preserved. He had ended up testing this out on a small animal after he left Archibald to Lucius. That aside, the reason this was important now was because it meant that the poison inside of the mammoth hadn't had a chance to spread more than it already had, leaving its corpse in the same state it had been when he had initially taken it out. Silas knew how dangerous this matter would be, but focused himself. He had already decided from the moment that he attacked the pig demon village that there was no going back now. The only way was forward, and if he wanted a piece of this world to call his own, he could only take risks. He formed the rune in the air. After analyzing it for so long, he was able to form it with a single stamp just like he had learned through the trial. It was thanks to his confidence that he took out the mammoth now instead of waiting. The rune reflected a delicate green light, different from the harsh blue that the full ice poison rune was capable of. Silas had already come to realize that whenever his will was involved, his ether would become tinged with green. He didn't know if it was a coincidence or not, but the shade seemed to be identical to his own eyes. With a breath, Silas pressed the rune into the open wound of the mammoth. He was starting with one of the smaller ones, and his target was the very same wound that had allowed the poison to infiltrate its body to begin with. Quickly, Silas' eyes brightened. It worked, it really did. A part of him wasn't certain because all of these ideas came from a vague intuition of sorts that came from his legendary path. But now, he couldn't deny it at all. With Enchanted Scribe activated, he could see the changes to his rune, and he could see the purple-green poison begin to sublimate out of the wound. It bubbled up, diffusing through layers of flesh and being pulled into the rune. Thanks to the suppression and oppression aspects, the poison was bottled up inside the rune, causing it to slowly change color. When Silas felt that it had reached its limits, he stopped. He put the mammoth back into the madness key so that the poison wouldn't spread any further, and then he turned to the window to throw it out. However, just as he was going to, he paused. His gaze flashed over to the Arctic King Cobra's venom pouch. Runes danced across its surface and he saw something special within. Part of the runes he had grown so familiar with were swimming within it. The moment Silas saw it, he knew what to do. Instead of throwing his infected rune out of the window, he pressed it into the Arctic King Cobra's venom pouch. Then, after recovering, he pulled the mammoth out once more to repeat the process again and again. Chapter 254 Go on. It took Silas until the next day to finish. He believed that the reason it was so difficult was for two main reasons. The first were his runes. They were small and unimpressive compared to the vastness of the mammoth that he was dealing with. He believed that he could make them larger and carry a greater capacity if he were to use more ether and more effort, but he felt that the return wasn't worth it, especially since he was technically still in a dangerous situation. It was in his best interest to stay as close to 100% as possible. The second reason was the reference he used to make the runes in the first place. He had learned a lot about the fundamentals of runes, and one of those teachings was about the different categories and grades of them. Runes weren't as straightforward as levels and had three main facets to them. The first was grade. All runes that Silas could even think about using for now were F grade. By the same token, all of the runes that made up the laws of Earth were likewise F grade. The second was ether. Mature versus immature ether, as well as one's level, played a role in how powerful the rune was. Silas' ether was still immature because he was still level 0 and still in the process of trying to excavate all of the potential he could from within himself. The third facet was a vague concept known as complexity. All F-grade runes were created equal, but they could be combined and used together. For example, the Ice Poison rune had 12 F-grade runes combined to form it. The Poison Extraction rune that Silas had just created was made up of a third of the Ice Poison rune. Silas hadn't learned if there was an upper limit or not, but he was sure that there was likely a limit at some point or another. Regardless, 12 certainly wasn't that limit. All things considered, a rune with 12 parts was still considered to be lower class. There was a reason that a level 7 like the Arctic King Cobra could use it. But then again, what the Cobra was doing and what Silas was doing were two different things entirely. The Cobra was relying on an innate ability that came as naturally as a gene talent. Silas, on the other hand, was forming the runes himself. The two weren't even on the same planet. While the Arctic King Cobra had a far easier time than Silas did, Silas could scale and had a far longer path to follow. This was all to say that Silas had small tools right now, but the poison he was trying to deal with came from a level 18. Though he wasn't quite aware of this just yet, he knew that the man he had fought was a true powerhouse. Regardless, after so long, he had managed to succeed, and now he had not only to manage to cleanse all of the mammoth corpses, but... Silas looked toward the Cobra's corpse. Its venom pouch, which had been radiating an icy steel blue color, was now tainted by veins of green and purple. Even so, the air that it gave off was several times more lethal than it had been in the past. It even looked as though the venom pouch was struggling to keep it all contained. By the time Silas had finished with the first mammoth, it had already been reaching its limit. It could only handle the poison in 1.5. Silas wasn't yet sure how he would make use of this poison sac, but he already knew that at a critical moment, it could very well save his life. Now that he was more familiar with the runes, he was also confident enough to cut the rest of the venom pouch out of the Cobra's body and store it away separately. Then, he called the Basilisk King out. "Go on," Silas said, pointing toward the mammoth. The Basilisk King slithered forward. It was no longer anywhere near as shaken when it was around Silas. Silas still wasn't sure what it meant, but in the end, he had cleared 2 trials for the Basilisk King. So much of its pride had returned. The Basilisk King dove forward, its jaws opening wide as it bit down. Its teeth seemed much more substantial than normal snakes. Even the Arctic King Cobra had fragile, translucent teeth. But the Basilisk King looked like a true predator. Even so, it ran into a wall immediately. The constitution of the mammoth, even in death, was exceptional. However, Silas didn't show any signs of helping. He just stood there, his arms crossed, and his gaze cool. The Basilisk King seemed to have had its pride provoked. Its golden slit eyes flashed, and it dove in again and again, relentless in its forward pursuit. Minutes later, it finally got down to the bone, but that was its next challenge. How should it break through this skull to reach the gene core it wanted? It had to be remembered that the gene core was the source of energy a beast had. It was where one could take its genes, and it was also what could be sacrificed to mature one's ether and level up. Of course, Silas always chose to take the genes instead, and now, the Basilisk King would have to get to it on its own. With a bloody maw, the basilisk looked back at Silas as though to check if he would be helping it. But when it saw Silas' stance, it felt a hint of embarrassment and then another hint of rage. It was the mighty Basilisk King. When had it ever needed to keel over and ask a human for help? It growled, and a hiss that made one's blood curdle echoed. The battle cry of the Basilisk King could make one's soul flee. Its tail rose high into the air, and it lashed out. Chapter 255 Clearance. Bang, bang, bang. Silas didn't know how long the Basilisk King spent pounding the mammoth's skull, but it was enough that its scales began to fall off and blood seeped through the gaps. Soon, it was difficult to tell whether the blood came from the mammoth or the Basilisk King. However, its efforts were soon returned with blessings. Crack! The Basilisk King unleashed a howl, its maw opening as wide as Silas' head as it bit down, shattering the cracked skull. In a single gulp, it swallowed the gene core. Silas' gaze glowed. He had begun to grow a bit worried. The Basilisk King was truly hurting itself, but after the first glance back, it didn't look again. He knew that this was the Basilisk King's own personal effort, he couldn't interfere. In the end, it had worked out. And now, Silas' eyes narrowed. He felt a shuddering aura coming from the Basilisk King, but there also didn't seem to be much change. Basilisk King, FF+. Level, 5. Physical, 80. Greater than, Strength, 111. Greater than, Constitution, 123. Greater than, Dexterity, 42. Greater than, Speed, 45. Mental, 72. Greater than, Intelligence, 99. Greater than, Wisdom, 19. Greater than, Charisma, 97. Will, 91. There was indeed no change. Now that Silas thought about it, he had given the basilisk a lot to eat since he had had him. Many of those meals included gene cores as well. Logically speaking, if a beast progressed like humans did, then it should have long since grown beyond level 5. And yet, it hadn't. Clearly, that meant that it required something else to improve. But what he questioned was whether he was correct about the reason. After all, the Basilisk King wasn't a normal creature, it was a beast from a dungeon. It didn't come from Earth's extinct creatures either, but it was instead its own mythology. In that case, when dealing with it, it was likely that there were many things that he couldn't accurately predict. Even so, he had thought that by following this intuition of his, he would be able to help it. But why didn't it? Silas didn't hesitate to take out a second mammoth. Again, he said calmly. The Basilisk King's gaze flashed with a hint of despair when it saw a new mammoth replace the first. But soon, the flames inside of it were stoked again. It refused to allow Silas to see its weakness. These prey were already dead. If it didn't even dare to collect what was before it, how could it be a king? The Basilisk King raised a bloodied tail to start once more. Silas' eyes narrowed. Its injuries have healed somewhat. At least by 50%. Good. Silas nodded and watched the Basilisk King begin another relentless pursuit, but he remained calm. Time and time again, the Basilisk King thought the nightmare was over, only for it to start again. That was when the strongest of the mammoths came out. This was the very same one that the bouncer lookalike had been fighting when Silas arrived, and it was the last one that Silas managed to snatch. It also happened to be the one that was the most difficult to clear of its poison. Even in death, the Basilisk King felt a great amount of pressure facing it, as did Silas. Silas felt that even if he helped, they two of them together might not be able to do anything to this corpse. The mammoth was so large that it barely fit in the basement at all. If not for the fact that this was a particularly large cottage, then there wouldn't be room to even stand in here with it, let alone attack it. This time, Silas didn't urge the Basilisk King. He could feel that it was storing up something deep within its body, gathering up its courage. And then, it burst like a dam. The Basilisk King felt all sorts of feelings of inferiority while staring at this mammoth. Silas never learned the level of this mammoth because the situation had been too chaotic back then, but the Basilisk King could tell. It was a level 10. An FFF plus monster. Not only was the Basilisk King only a level 5, but it wasn't even in the triple Fs in terms of grade. There was a huge dividing line between F plus and FF, not to mention FF plus and FFF. On top of that, between FFF, FFF, and FFF plus, there were large chasms between each and every one. Facing this suppression, a beast felt it more intimately than a human ever could. Beaten and bloodied, the Basilisk King could only hear the sound of its own hissing breath. Staring at the mammoth corpse, it felt a deep unwillingness inside of it. It unleashed a hiss that sounded like the howl of a steam engine. Silas would have covered his ears had he not been so focused on the moment. He could feel that something was coming. The Basilisk King accelerated forward and raised its tail up high. It twisted its body and slashed down with everything it had. Crack! Silas' pupils constricted. For every other mammoth, it took the Basilisk King several moments of effort before the first cracks appeared. But this time, the Basilisk King roared, raising its tail again. Dull gold light came from the crevices of its black scales, and it looked as though it was ready to destroy the world. However, its momentum suddenly died. The gold vanished, and its body swayed, collapsing to the ground. Silas rushed forward and caught the Basilisk King, but he felt relieved when he saw that it was only exhausted. That said, Quest, Sorrow of the Basilisk King, Bronze, completed. Clearance level, Bronze. Rewards. Greater than. Silas was confused by the reward for a moment until he saw it. Basilisk King, FFF. Level, 5. Physical, 125. Greater than, Strength, 176. Greater than, Constitution, 197. Greater than, Dexterity, 62. Greater than, Speed, 65. Mental, 113. Greater than, Intelligence, 151. Greater than, Wisdom, 41. Greater than, Charisma, 147. Will, 271. Silas' gaze sharpened when he saw the change to the Basilisk King's stats. Could it be that the gene core was never the key, but it was rather a conduit to awaken this monster's pride? No, that wasn't all. There was something else. Chapter 256 Awakened. Basilisk King, Status, Healthy, Subtle Mentality, Loyalty, 3/10. King's Bind, FFF, Skill, The gaze of a Basilisk King is supreme. Freeze, Mere Mortal, Cost, 5 ether unit per second, Limit, decided by every 10% gap in the average of will and charisma. King's Shift, FFF, Skill, Laws of the world do not bind the Basilisk King. Bend to my whims, be suppressed beneath my will, Cost, 5 ether unit, Limit, 1000 physical. King's Shield, FFF, Skill, you are unworthy to even touch the Basilisk King. My defenses are unmatched, Cost, 5 ether unit, Defense, 1000. The changes were quite shocking. It seemed that the Basilisk King's skills had changed along with its grade, each one more than doubling in strength. But the cost was that each one of these skills now cost 5 times more to cast just a single time. The only one that hadn't seemed to change at all was less than King's Bind, greater than. Or, rather, it almost seemed to have regressed. It gave in return the exact same limits, but now it cost 5 times more. However, Silas didn't dismiss it offhand. He had been in several battles now where his less than astral bind was dismissed by others. In fact, in his battle with Azrael, even less than King's Bind had been outright dismissed. If he was correct, then it should be the case that this higher grade of skill was more capable of outright ignoring binding skill counters. Maybe, if he used this version of less than King's Bind against Azrael, he wouldn't be able to counter it. Another shocking matter was that these skills were considered to be at the fragmented mastery stage. That meant that they still had a lot of room to grow. Silas remembered that the FF Plus version of less than King's Shield only had 400 defense, but after he increased his mastery over it, it increased to 600. But now it started at 1000 for fragmented mastery. If he increased its mastery now, it would be even more exaggerated. Now this was definitely a life-saving trump card, but he was also aware that he likely couldn't use it so freely in battle. The more ether a skill cost, and the lower the mastery, the more time it would take to successfully cast. As such, Silas' best bet was to save a combination that he was comfortable with in the stabilizing bracelet. I hope that the stabilizing bracelet can handle it. The bracelet was only a bronze item. Now that Silas thought about it, that should mean that it had a limit to the kind of skills that it could handle. It definitely wasn't without limits. Stabilizing bracelet, bronze, level 8, ability, store, evolve, store 3 skills to be deployed at any time to a bronze mastery plus a less than 1% boost per level, limit, XXX, skills charged, greater than, charge, 0/3, level up requirement, less than 9 common genes, durability, 9/10. Silas tried using his new scouting skill on the bracelet to see if he could get new information, and he could indeed see that there was a new line. But he couldn't see exactly what it was. After some thought, he fused madness into the skill and tried again. Limit, XXX. It remained the same. Silas was taken aback. He couldn't help but wonder what about this limit had to be hidden. This limit should refer to what the bracelet was capable of withstanding, but he couldn't quite understand why his scouting skill wasn't able to unearth those secrets. And unfortunately, the Basilisk King was in a dormant state, so he couldn't test to see whether the skills would work. Just when he was planning on packing up and leaving, he thought of something else. No, I'll wait. With the hibernation realm, the recovery of the Basilisk King is improved by 6,400%, an insane amount. That means injuries that would normally take 2 months to recover would not even take a single day. This, of course, wasn't just for injuries, it should mean mental recovery, and also refer to this slumber as well. That meant that in just a few hours at most, the Basilisk King should be back to 100%. Silas didn't know it now, but in the future, of all the abilities of his legendary path, the hibernation realm would without a doubt become the absolute most useful. What level of beast taming could one reach when what should have taken months to years of evolution could be shortened to just a few days? As expected, it didn't even take the Basilisk King an hour. In half an hour, Silas sensed that it was awake once more. So, he summoned it. The Basilisk King was still small compared to the other boss creatures that Silas had ever seen. It was 5 meters from end to end, and when it raised its head to face the world, it stood at about eye level with Silas. Its eyes had a deeper golden hue than before, and though the golden glow between its scales had vanished, its black scales had a more beautiful, healthy, and shiny luster to them. Staring into its eyes, Silas felt a pressure and dignity coming from it. He realized then that it should be the case that the Basilisk King's voice of a king gene talent had grown more powerful as well. Voice of a king, gene talent, a gene talent capable of cooling the mind and increasing the effectiveness of will and charisma. Your charisma activates passively, and those around you with weaker will are pulled into your orbit. Your skills and stats are more effective. Silas couldn't help but wonder why it was that the Basilisk King's level didn't increase, but for now, he wouldn't worry about it. So long as it could improve. That was the most important part. Plus, he had a pretty good idea of how to help it improve further. Quest received, Sorrow of the Basilisk King, Silver. A king without a kingdom. The basilisk is a fallen creature, from where? No one knows. Maybe even they have forgotten their former glory. You have met a basilisk whose pride has been shattered and whose will has been torn asunder. Remind this Basilisk King of who he is. Silver reward requirements greater than awaken the pride of the Basilisk King. Chapter 257 Quicktime Event. Silas walked out of the cabin with the Basilisk King by his side. Now that its stats had improved to this extent, it could keep up, and it had its value as a companion outside of their fusion. Plus, it was clear that the way to help the Basilisk King fully awaken its pride was through combat. So, he let the Basilisk King take the vanguard as they walked back toward the portal. In the meantime, he took out an orb. This orb was the final mammoth's gene core. The Basilisk King hadn't ended up swallowing it, and even if it did, judging by how things were going, it wouldn't level up regardless. There was definitely a special condition needed to help the Basilisk King level up, but for now, maybe it was best to wait on raising its grade to FFF plus first. He took out another orb, and this one was the gene core of the Arctic King Cobra. Both of them exuded quite sharp auras, one being heavy in the hand, and the other being frosty. Each one also had a bronze gene in them as well, so their value wasn't small. After looking for a bit, Silas put them away. He was right that there were, indeed, runes floating around, but they were too complicated for him to even begin to organize, let alone learn from. It seemed that he still had a long way to go. As for the stabilizing bracelet, it didn't struggle to accept the Basilisk King's new skills at all, it did it with ease. It made him all the more curious about just what those XXX marks meant. Silas looked up as a battle erupted. The Basilisk King fought against a groundhog-like creature. It was larger than a normal groundhog, but it was still only about 0.75 meters tall. The Basilisk King's greatest weakness was its dexterity and speed, lacking greatly in both. Against such a small creature, it was having its own fair share of problems. Usually, it could make up for this by using less than King's Shift greater than, the upgraded version of less than momentum shift that allowed it to suddenly change the entire momentum of its attack with a thought. But now, less than King's Shift cost 5 ether units, not to mention a great deal of concentration to cast on top of that. It couldn't be used in battle at all. On the one hand, it was good that the Basilisk King didn't need to worry about accumulating more skills and could just upgrade its own. But on the other, this was a very clear downside. In the end, the groundhog creature ended up running away. But as it turned its back, the Basilisk King's frustration boiled over and it cast less than King's Bind greater than. Silas felt a pressure rush toward him as well, and he was surprised to find that less than King's Bind greater than, though still a single target skill, still had some area of effect properties as well. He felt himself dull and slow by a small measure, though he shrugged it off quickly. The groundhog obviously couldn't fight back against this and found itself crushed with a single swipe of the Basilisk King's tail. With a wide maw, the Basilisk King swallowed it up in a single bite, not even chewing. The groundhog barely caused a bulge in its stomach. A bit embarrassed, the Basilisk King looked back toward Silas, but the latter still wore the same unreadable expression. Somehow, though, this made the Basilisk King far more relaxed. The two continued forward like this. Since they had come with the dire wolf, the journey back was much slower, but it did give the Basilisk King ample time to fight. Silas realized over time that while the Basilisk King was slow in body, its mind was quite sharp. It got used to its new stats, and Silas found that its effectiveness was increasing. This was likely related to its gene talent. It didn't have speed, so it made use of its environment. It didn't have dexterity, so it was careful with when it chose to attack, but it also knew when to rely on its high constitution to tank when it needed to and its high strength to deal an immediate death blow. At first, its win rate was low. Well, it didn't necessarily lose, but the creatures it faced more than once managed to run away and keep their lives. But by the fifth battle, it was a sure win every time. It learned to restrain its aura so that other beasts weren't scared away, and by the time Silas could see the portal in the distance, the Basilisk King had fought its 12th battle, and it managed to still retain half its ether, having managed to win every battle except a few with its physical stats alone. Silas nodded. This creature is intelligent, it's not a normal animal. In fact, its intelligence is almost frightening. I shouldn't measure how smart a creature is based on whether it can talk or not. This Basilisk King is smarter than most humans, at least in combat. Silas felt his heart tremble as he looked up. He placed a hand to his chest, and his pupils couldn't help but constrict. The last time he had had this feeling. My luck again. Come back, Silas called. The Basilisk King obeyed, and quickly it and Silas shifted to the side, returning to a region of thick shrubbery as they looked toward the pulsing portal in the distance. Because of the suburban neighborhood that was in the way, Silas had to climb a tree just to see over the homes, and that was when what his heart had sensed happened. It was an army of them. There must have been at least 50 Arctic king cobras that appeared simultaneously, but they weren't the ones that Silas was paying such close attention to. Following in behind them, a gorgeous Arctic king cobra appeared. Its body was majestic, and it contained the very same golden glow that the Basilisk King couldn't maintain. QuickTime event triggered, Wrath of the Arctic Emperor Cobra, level recommended, 20, description, the son of the Arctic Emperor Cobra has died, stoking the flames of fury in his father, event type, 2-path, clear requirements, greater than, kill Arctic Emperor Cobra, OR greater than, kill his son's murderer. Silas' eyes widened. He understood immediately who this was targeting. He made a decision instantly, run. Unfortunately, he didn't get the chance. A pillar of golden light descended, and a beacon solidified above his head. Chapter 258 Going. Silas looked up into the skies. His gaze was frighteningly cold at the moment, and truthfully, rather than fear, he felt completely infuriated. At that moment, he realized something profound about this world. When he entered the Slithering Madness dungeon and ended up losing 3 months of improvement time, he blamed himself. When he entered the Basilisk King's dungeon and lost consciousness after a breakthrough and a title was granted to him, he blamed himself. When he got stuck in the volcano and lost consciousness once again because of the disc, he blamed himself. But what had he done wrong this time? He just happened to kill the wrong beast. And now a practically sure death QuickTime event was triggered with him as the main character. How could you even avoid this? By digging a hole for yourself, jumping inside, and never coming out. And then what? Would you just never improve? Would you just watch as the world you were born and raised in was razed to the ground and taken over by greedy otherworlders? The more Silas thought about it, the more furious he became. Right then, he understood what the madness key meant more than ever. How do I complete the summoned ascension? Become strong, become strong. There was no other explanation, no amount of planning, no amount of caution, and apparently no amount of luck that would help him. What had his luck done but let him know a few seconds earlier that something was coming? Even it couldn't stop this. The only path forward was to become so strong, so in control of everything, that it didn't matter what was thrown at you. In the end, there would only be one path out. Victory. A fiery light burned in Silas' eyes, and the Basilisk King felt shaken for a moment. When it looked at Silas, it was as though his entire body was covered in raging green flames. Silas reached out a hand and touched the Basilisk King. It was quickly sent into the hibernation realm. Then, he turned around and shot toward the deeper parts of the forest. There was still a beacon above his head, but it was fading. In the end, there was nothing but a faint aura and a golden badge hanging over his head. However, the Arctic Emperor Cobra had already spotted the pillar. As though it instinctively knew what it had to do, it released a menacing roar. As Silas ran, he felt his hair stand on end. It was the kind of roar he had only ever heard in movie theaters, the kind of roar that could only be released by an ancient, slumbering beast that had been truly infuriated to its limit. The army of Arctic King Cobras surged toward the forest. While this was happening, notifications of the QuickTime event were sent all over the region. Anyone within a few hours was given this very same notification. Chaos broke out because it wasn't just those that hit the level requirement that were given access. In fact, there had yet to be a single level 20 on Earth as far as the leaderboards were concerned. This was the first time a quest notification was spread to so many people at once, and many of those that felt that they had missed out by not entering the trial were already beginning to grow antsy. The government immediately activated a trained protocol, increasing security. However, it was inevitable that some would slip through the cracks. Unfortunately, the government didn't have time to mind them because if this notification was true, then this was the largest opportunity to appear since the start of the summoned ascension. A level 20 recommendation was bound to come with unfathomable rewards. You three will go as the hidden force. The rest will be the vanguard to temperature check the situation. That region is much closer to their territory, so do not expose yourselves too easily or there may be a trap lying in wait. Shakari Edison, level 17. Osrius Fleming, level 17. Injigba Mauen, level 17. The three figures nodded. Wearing black military garb, and even having rifles strapped to their backs, they looked forward coldly, their posture impeccable and their ether swirling in the depths of their eyes. Soon, they left the office only to be surrounded by at least 100 other government members, each one ready for battle. If the recommended level was so high, the only way for them to make up for it was with numbers. The good thing about these QuickTime events was precisely that there were no such limits. Head out. A fake commander gave out his orders, but the three men and women followed as though they were just one of the crew without the slightest reluctance. Viridian University. The college had an ancient feel to it, one that made it look more like a lost school of magic than it did a place of modern education. The bricks were wreathed in vines, moss, and aged browns, the buildings were tall, but not too much so, and there seemed to be hidden underground passages dotted across the campus. Of course, these underground passages were just meant to make traveling from class to class in the dead of winter far more convenient, but without this context, it really did feel like something mysterious was going on. At that moment, in one of these underground passages, a similar meeting was going on, but all of their faces were shrouded by mystery. The vanguard has already set out. You alone will be going this time. Damn, no support. What am I supposed to do alone, boss? Where's the justice? The man seemed used to the young man's antics and didn't react very strongly to this matter at all. During the last operation, you lost us several bronze genes. Hey, that wasn't my fault. Didn't we succeed? Plus, that guy was. The man held up a hand. The government will expect us to send a lot of elites, but our thoughts are elsewhere. This will be your chance to redeem yourself, and if you can claim this victory, you will be rewarded. Alright, "All right, I'm going." The young man waved a hand and headed out, still mumbling to himself. "I wonder which poor bastard got this hat placed on his head." If Silas had been there, he would recognize this young man immediately. Alex Reynolds. Chapter 259. Silas' gaze was sharp as he ran. He had taken in quite a lot about the environment on his way here. The system wasn't allowing him to summon the dire wolf right now. He assumed that he would be in a perpetual combat state until the QuickTime event came to an end, though once again, he felt that it was unfair. Still, crying about it wasn't going to change anything. His luck had mostly been useless in this situation, but had he not listened to it, he would have been several times closer to the portal than he was now. At the very least, this time, there was at least a kilometer between himself and them. What he needed was a place that he could take advantage of to secure a quick victory. In the past, it used to take him an hour to walk from the university home. If he ran that distance instead, doing it in about 16 to 17 minutes wasn't an issue. With the stats of people now, taking less than 10 minutes was practically a given. In fact, if they used mounts as well, he could expect that within 5 minutes, he would be surrounded from all sides. His best chance was to take down the Arctic Emperor Cobra as quickly as possible, but there were several issues. First, and most obviously, it was surrounded by 50 others. He had to be cautious when fighting against just a single level 7 Cobra, but who knew how many level 7s there were in that army of 50? In fact, level 7 might just be a minimum requirement to even join their Emperor in this crusade. Second, the Arctic Emperor Cobra was powerful in its own right. Even with his beast totem, he wasn't sure if he could defeat it, and he had yet to even test out if his beast totem was effective against more than one target at once. He was too far from the Cobra to get an exact reading on its stats, so he had no choice but to plan for the absolute worst, and that was the possibility that this Arctic Emperor Cobra might very well be a level 20 in its own right. There. Keeping a cool head, Silas knew that what he needed was a method that could both end this battle quickly and save him from being surrounded from all sides. He burst into the region of the cottages once again. It was a small community of expensive cottages, some of which were built right into the hillside. The cottages surrounded the lake and river, and there were trees and forests galore. The cottages were constructed so that their backyards faced the water, while their front faces looked into dense forestry. Silas had already decided that this would be his battleground. It had the best combination of open and dense that he needed. Depending on the situation, he could adapt if necessary. At the same time, a Rolodex of the Arctic King Cobra abilities filled his mind and he was already prepared to make contingencies for them all. But first, he rushed up the side of a cottage. As he passed by, he kicked the small yacht's anchor up, sending it gliding into the waters. After finding a relatively flat surface, he set up a ballista, then moved onto another house and repeated. By the time he set up his third ballista, he could already feel the temperature plummeting. The Arctic King Cobras moved as though they were a domain in their own right. Silas slipped down the backside of a cottage and rushed forward. The beacon above his head whirred and it seemed that as those targeting him came closer, he would become easier to spot. However, it was a double-edged sword. That was because Silas realized that he could sense them as well, and with his visualization, he didn't just feel a vague location, but rather felt an exact whereabouts, to the point that he could see their faces and expressions reflected in his mind. Ultimately, army or not, the Arctic King Cobras didn't have discipline. They slithered through the forest with menacing hisses, and there was no order to their formation at all. They were clearly out for blood and blood alone. That was the good news. The bad news was that Silas had been right before. Even the weakest of them was level 7, and amongst them, there were actually 5 level 10s. In that case, just what level was the Arctic Emperor Cobra? And that was when it entered the range of Silas' senses as well. Silas had already known it was big. He had personally seen it back then, but he was so shocked by the sudden QuickTime event that he didn't get a good look at it. But now it was practically searing its image into his mind. The Arctic Emperor Cobra had a body that was at least 25 meters in length. When it rose up, it towered at over 10 meters, and its open hood seemed like it could blot out the sun in the sky. It was still an impossibly gorgeous creature, even in comparison to the others of its kind that Silas had seen. Every one of its scales was a polished white, but unlike its son, it looked as though there were hidden worlds of fluttering blue runes dancing within, as though each scale was its own snow globe. On its head, hovering like a halo, there was a dull light that was hard to spot properly, but it was enough to make its aura all the more imposing. It seemed to be the slowest of the cobras around it, but Silas knew that that was nothing more than an illusion. It was being restricted by the system in all likelihood. Silas could see the runes wrapping around it, slowing its progress down. However, once those training wheels fell, Silas would be in for the danger of a lifetime. Even though that danger had yet to come, he could already feel it. Arctic Emperor Cobra. Level 12. Even with his madness on full blast, even with his new scouting skill, this was all he could see. His heart shuddered. Something told him that those dashes in place of its grade were very, very different from Azrael's question marks. This creature could slap the mammoth he ran away from to death with a single swipe. Chapter 260 Hibernation. Silas took a breath, and his gaze sharpened. His ether thrummed within him, and he felt his intent blazing. He summoned the Basilisk King, and his beast totem appeared behind him. In that moment, the Basilisk King surged with power, and its golden eyes seemed to only become deeper. After just a few minutes in the hibernation realm, it had already returned to a 100% state. In fact, Silas was sure that even if it was completely drained, just 20 or 30 seconds would be enough. However, its recovery ability wasn't the only thing that it could rely on. Basilisk King, FFF. Level 5. Physical, 300. Greater than Strength, 422. Greater than Constitution, 473. Greater than Dexterity, 149. Greater than Speed, 156. Mental, 271. Greater than Intelligence, 362. Greater than Wisdom, 98. Greater than Charisma, 353. Will, 650. The Basilisk King unleashed an almost manic howl. Its body expanded, and a set of golden eyes appeared to its back. At the same time, Silas realized that the oppression of his beast totem had been transferred over to the Basilisk King in part. The Basilisk King shot out from behind the house, its momentum lethal as its body ripped out the grass. Its abdominal muscles slithered and wreathed, each powerful stroke leaving deep lines in the soft soil. Silas rushed in behind it, 3 ballista bolts appearing high in the air behind him. One of his minds was occupied by maintaining his beast totem, another was used to scan his visualization area, and a third was used to control his body itself. As for the rest, he poured it all into controlling these ballista bolts. He trailed exactly 20 meters behind the Basilisk King. Hisses suddenly filled the air, and a dense cold spread. They entered the dense forest, and carnage was unleashed. Arctic King Cobra, FFF. Level 8. Physical, 189. Mental, 221. Will, 154. 3 level 8s appeared all at once. The Basilisk King rose up, prepared to attack. It got into a rhythmic stance, ready to continue along with its usual cadence of movement, but that was when Silas' voice rang out. Don't conserve anything. Give it everything you've got. Tank everything they have. They cannot break your defenses. You are a king. Act like it. The ring of violence appeared in the Basilisk King's slit irises as though it had been provoked. It heard Silas' command and then acted on it. Its maw opened wide, and suddenly the Arctic King Cobras looked small and insignificant. The Basilisk King ripped into the throat of one as the 2 others attacked it from the sides. But as though it hadn't seen him at all, it completely ignored them. Clang, clang. The 2 cobras tried to sink their teeth into the body of the Basilisk King, only for their fangs to shatter. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Silas launched 2 bolts that ripped through the bloodied maws. They collapsed without even the ability to resist. By this point, 5 more cobras had appeared. They swarmed over from all sides, and though Silas knew that there were only 50 of them, it felt like he was facing an endless torrent. The beast totem rose high into the air, a pair of golden slit eyes suffocating everything within a 50-meter range. At the same time, 5 pairs of less than chilling scythe greater than S appeared, slashing through the forest. But they were too far away. Silas directly told the Basilisk King to ignore them. As expected, The steel blue sides collided with the trees, exploding with a chilling aura, but never managed to make it to them. "Retreat," Silas commanded, and the two slipped backward. His eyes continued to dart around as the 5 cobras swiftly closed in. But at the same time, he could feel that more were coming. The air was only becoming chillier. The portal alone was a heavy influence, the fact that winter was on its way was another, but right here, right now, the cobras were definitely the largest culprits. Silas could feel a looming gaze coming toward him from the distance, and it made his hair stand on end. However, it was precisely this that spurred him on. "Come on." Silas barely registered the thought. It came on its own accord, but he felt fed up with everything in this world already. A maddened glint lit in his eyes, and the gluttony seed churned. 5 cobras shot toward them, and because they were retreating backward, they caught up in barely a few seconds. But that much was fine, Silas was already expecting this. 5 less than chilling scythe greater than S appeared again, but this time they didn't seem dodgeable. "Tank it," Silas called out while summoning a less than solidify for himself. He rushed toward 2 of the cobras. Bang! 2 of the scythes landed on his shield, and 3 landed on the Basilisk King's body. But aside from a small crackle of ice, nothing more came. Silas' understanding of these techniques was already deep. He knew that in the Basilisk King's current state, it would take much more to harm it. The 2 moved in opposite directions, and Silas' scorned raps flashed. 3 ballista bolts targeted a single cobra, and Silas descended onto the other with a vicious fist. He sensed the less than Arctic howlerven before it came. He cast less than momentum shift in one of his ballista bolts, and his fist reeled back in a perfect feint. Both Arctic King Cobras cast the defensive skill at the same time, but they mistimed it. Silas activated Tail Whip for the first time in a long while and drove a leg right through the head of the cobra. At the same time, 2 ballista bolts rebounded off the body of the second cobra, only for the third to wait out the duration of its skill and suddenly drill through its eye socket. Silas didn't even wait for them to hit the ground, turning back with a fiery light in his eyes. 3 cobras had leapt onto the body of the Basilisk King while one hung from its maw. More Arctic King cobras slithered toward them through the trees, and right behind them, a menacing presence loomed. The Arctic Emperor Cobra and 5 of its level 10 elites.